My name is Sharon, and I'm 62 years old. I've lived most of my life in the shadow of someone else's decisions, but lately, I've started to see the truth of it all. For the past 28 years, I've been married to Tom, my husband, my partner, and, in a way, my antagonist. Our marriage began full of promises, dreams of building a life together, of supporting each other through thick and thin. It wasn't always easy, but like most couples, we made it work. Or at least I did. We bought our house when we were in our 30s, freshly settled into our lives in the suburbs. The house isn't anything special by today's standards, a modest single-family home with a backyard big enough to host summer BBQs and garden parties, though I've never had much interest in those. At least, I never did back then. The house was meant to be our sanctuary, a place to raise our children, a place to feel like we belonged. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, with rows of houses just like ours, each family living their own story, most of them living just as I did, going through the motions, pretending that everything was fine. The house is in Tom's name, always was, but I've paid for half of it. Every mortgage payment for years has come from my share of the business money, my accounting skills keeping us afloat. When Tom and I started our auto parts store, it was supposed to be something we'd build together. I handled the books, managed the finances, made sure everything was in order. Tom did the selling, the dealing, the endless work of keeping the business running day to day. He was the face of it, the one people saw when they walked through the door. But I kept the back office in check. I made sure things didn't fall apart. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. The years have been kind in their own way. We raised two children who grew up into adults, both carving their own paths, paths that didn't seem to need us quite as much. Now it's just Tom and me in this house, just him mostly. I'm still here, of course, but in the background. Quiet, unseen. This year, though, this year things feel different. I can't put my finger on it. Maybe it's the ache in my back from bending over the counter too long, or the quiet in the house, the kind of silence that makes you wonder if anyone can hear you at all. Tom's annual Memorial Day BBQ is a tradition. He hosts it every year, bringing together a group of friends, a few colleagues from the store, and, on occasion, family. I've never minded it before. In fact, I've always kind of enjoyed it. The house fills with the smell of sizzling meat, the sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses. It was his way of showing off, of being the center of attention for a few hours, and I'd stand in the background, like I always did, quietly flipping burgers, making sure the drinks were full, checking on the kids when they were too noisy, and offering everyone the perfect sides to go with their grilled meat. But this year, everything felt like it was slipping away. I've been in this house for nearly 3 decades. I know every creak of the floorboards, the scent of the air in the backyard when the sun sets just right. I know the sound of the grill heating up, the way Tom walks when he's excited about something, his steps a little faster, a little lighter, as if he's on the edge of something new, something better. But this year, I wasn't even asked to cook. Not in any real sense. Tom simply appointed me. "I'll go meet the guests," he said casually, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. He had always been the one to mingle, the life of the party, the one who made people feel welcome. But this time, he didn't ask me to greet anyone. He didn't suggest we do it together, like we had so many times before. Instead, he told me what my role would be. I'd be at the grill, cooking the burgers, the hot dogs, the sausages. Not that it bothered me at first. I've always been the one who takes care of things like that. But there was something in his voice, a tone maybe, that made me feel small. And that's where I stood. For 2 hours, I stood at the grill, my hands burning as I flipped burgers, flipping them one by one, carefully checking the heat of the coals, trying to keep everything in order. I wore the apron he'd bought for me last year, just a plain black one with nothing special on it. It was my uniform for these events, my role in the choreography that was our life. As the guests began to filter into the backyard, laughing, chatting, clinking their glasses, I noticed something strange. No one asked about me. They asked about the food. They complimented Tom on the grill, on the beer selection, on the amazing spread. But no one even seemed to notice me standing there, diligently flipping burgers. Not that I expected them to, but something about it was different this year. Tom was too busy schmoozing, too busy holding court with the guests. He didn't even look at me. And then one of his colleagues, a woman named Katya, 34 years old, sharp, attractive, came up to the grill where I was cooking. She looked me over, took a slow breath, and asked, "Where's the salad?" I smiled, trying to keep it light. "Tom's the one with the salad, sweetie." She raised an eyebrow and smirked. "Oh, I guess I'll go ask him then. You know, that's more his thing than yours." I didn't say anything, just nodded. But something in her voice, something in her posture, in the way she looked at me, like she knew exactly where I belonged and where I didn't, stuck in my chest. Tom didn't even hear it. He was too busy with his guests. And that was when it hit me. I wasn't even mentioned as the hostess of the house. Not once, not even by Tom. As the hours dragged on, I continued to stand at the grill, my feet aching, my back sore, the sun beating down on me as if it were trying to remind me of my place. The air was thick with the scent of grilled meat, the smoke curling into the sky, mixing with the hum of laughter and conversation around me. Tom was in his element. He always was at these things. He was the center of attention, surrounded by guests, colleagues, old friends. His loud voice rang out over the chatter, telling stories, laughing with people, making jokes. He was everything I wasn't. He was effortless in the way he commanded attention, in the way people naturally gravitated toward him. It was always like that. But today, it felt more pronounced. It felt like there was a wall between us, a wall that I had never noticed before, or maybe just never cared to acknowledge. I wasn't invited into the conversation. I wasn't part of the jokes or the laughter. No one seemed to see me, really. I wasn't a guest, and I wasn't the hostess. I was just there, in the background, making sure everything went smoothly while everyone else had a good time. It was as if I were invisible. The other guests, the ones who knew me best, tried to be polite. They'd glance over at the grill, offer a quick smile, but then quickly turn away to join the rest of the crowd. A few complimented the food, but it wasn't like the praise was directed at me. It was always directed at Tom. "Great spread, Tom. This is delicious, Tom." I smiled and nodded, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. But it was Katya who pushed me to my limit. She stood by the grill talking to Tom as if I weren't there. She wasn't even pretending to be polite. She'd make these little comments, these little jabs, just loud enough for me to hear. "The burgers could use a little more seasoning," she said with a smile, her eyes flicking toward me. "But hey, I'm sure Sharon's doing her best." Tom laughed, oblivious. He wasn't even paying attention to how I was being treated, how Katya was undermining me. Instead, he was busy sharing a story with a group of his friends, his hands waving as he spoke, oblivious to my presence. I watched them interact. Tom and Katya, that is. She was leaning in, laughing at his jokes, touching his arm a little too often. It wasn't just friendly. I could see it. There was something there, something more than just colleagues. I'd noticed it before, the way she would linger just a little too long whenever he was near, the way he'd laugh a little harder when she spoke. It wasn't much, but it didn't need to be. I've lived with Tom long enough to know when something's off, when there's a tension between them, and I felt it, right then, like a sharp, jagged thing scraping against my chest. I wasn't just invisible, I was being erased. At some point, I stopped smiling, stopped trying to make polite conversation with the few stragglers who came by the grill. I didn't care anymore. I was tired. I was sick of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I just wanted to get through the evening without falling apart. The sun started to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden light across the backyard. The heat from the grill was starting to feel stifling, like it was closing in around me. I wiped my hands on my apron and glanced around the yard. There was a pile of empty beer bottles by the corner of the fence, and the laughter from the guests was starting to fade, replaced by the sound of the crickets in the distance. Tom was still talking to Katya, his arm draped across the back of her chair. I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't stand being invisible any longer. As the last guest lingered, I quietly made my way to the back door and slipped inside. The cool air of the house, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat outside. I could hear Tom still laughing with his friends, their voices fading as I closed the door behind me. I didn't say a word. I didn't say goodbye, or thank you, or even acknowledge his presence. I just went to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and sat at the table. My hands were shaking slightly as I sipped, my mind racing. I was no longer angry. I wasn't even upset. I was just numb. I had become a ghost in my own life. I watched the clock on the wall as the evening wore on. Tom didn't come inside until much later, after the last of the guests had gone home. By then, I had already started to clean up, clearing away the empty bottles, putting away the leftovers. He didn't even notice the effort I'd put in, the hours I'd spent cooking, making sure everything was perfect. He didn't thank me, didn't even acknowledge my presence when he walked in. Instead, he plopped down in his chair and clicked on the TV, just as if nothing had happened, as if the night had gone off without a hitch. He didn't notice the silence that hung between us, the tension that had built up over the years. I finished cleaning up in the kitchen and went to bed, exhausted, but not in the way I usually felt after a long day. This was different. This was a deeper kind of tired, the kind that weighed on your soul. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The house felt empty, even though I wasn't alone. Tom was in the next room, his breathing steady and slow as he slept, unaware of the thoughts racing through my mind. I had lived my life for him, for our family, for the business. I had given everything I had, my time, my energy, my love, and all I had in return was this. A marriage that had become nothing more than a hollow shell, a routine I had grown too used to. And then, in the silence of that night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait anymore. I wasn't going to let him do this to me. I wasn't going to let him erase me. The next morning, I went to my desk, opened the drawer, and took out the folder I'd been keeping for a year. Inside were all the documents I had been collecting: bank transfers, receipts, records of purchases, and car leases, all the things Tom thought I hadn't noticed, all the things he thought I hadn't seen. But I had, and I was going to use them. I was going to make sure I wasn't invisible anymore. The next few days blurred into each other, the weight of what I'd seen and learned gnawing at my insides. The house felt even more suffocating than usual. The silence between us had grown thick, palpable, like a wall I couldn't tear down. Tom had his routine. He went to work, came home, sat in front of the TV, occasionally mumbled something to me as if we were roommates, not partners. He didn't ask about my day. He didn't care. I kept thinking back to the barbecue. How could he treat me like that, in front of everyone? How could he make me feel so invisible in my own home, in front of people I had known for years? And that woman, Katya. I had been giving him the benefit of the doubt for so long, but seeing them together like that, it was clear now. He was not just dismissing me, he was replacing me. I had known for a while that things weren't right. There were little signs, whispers in the corners of my mind, but I hadn't wanted to face the truth. I had stayed blind to it because confronting it meant acknowledging that my whole life had been a lie. But that night, everything changed. Tom had gone to bed early, exhausted after a long day at work. I didn't go to bed with him. I couldn't. My mind was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had to be done. I needed to take control of my life again, not just wait for him to give it back to me. I went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and then I made my way to my office. I had set up my small desk in the corner of the spare room years ago, long before Tom decided that I'd be better off handling the bookkeeping for our business rather than anything that might actually be fulfilling to me. It wasn't much of an office, but it had been mine, a place where I could escape from the routine of the house and the store. The file I'd been building for a year was waiting for me, nestled between a stack of old bills and tax returns. I opened it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside were all the documents I had collected, records of bank transfers, receipts from our joint accounts, copies of car leases I knew nothing about, and evidence of the business deals Tom had been hiding. It was all there. He hadn't been careful. It wasn't just the money he'd hidden, though. It was the way he had used me, how he had manipulated me into thinking that everything was fine, that I was appreciated. He had taken my labor, my time, my love, and then he'd thrown me away. He was never going to change, not unless I did something. I pulled out the papers I had carefully organized, proof of his infidelity, the funds he had transferred into hidden accounts, receipts for lavish purchases he had made with money that should have been ours. I had taken my time, watched him, listened to his conversations when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I had even followed him a few times when he said he was working late. It was all too easy to see the lies. I ran my fingers over the stack of documents, the cold reality of the situation setting in. I wasn't mad anymore. I wasn't upset. I was beyond that. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about making sure that the life I had built, the life that I had invested in, wasn't for nothing. I had spent 28 years with him. I had worked, I had sacrificed, and I had raised our family. This was my turn. But before I did anything, I needed to make sure I had all the pieces in place. I needed a plan. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had stored in my contacts for months, ever since I first started suspecting that Tom wasn't being honest with me. My heart raced as the phone rang. The silence felt deafening, the weight of everything hanging on this one moment. Hello? The voice on the other end was calm, professional. It was the lawyer I had met with months ago, the one who had been helping me prepare for this day. It's Sharon, I said, my voice steady but betraying a hint of the tension that had been building inside me. I'm ready to proceed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the soft rustle of papers as the lawyer checked something on their end. Are you sure? He asked carefully. Once we begin, there's no turning back. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of my decision settle over me. I had never been one to back down, not from a challenge, not from what was mine. I'm sure, I replied, my voice unwavering. It's time. The lawyer was quick to reassure me. He reminded me that everything I had was protected by law, that I had the right to a fair division of assets, especially since the business was technically a joint venture, and the house, despite being in Tom's name, had been partially financed by my money. Good, he said, his voice firm. I'll begin the process. We'll freeze the assets, start the paperwork. We'll make sure Tom understands that you won't be left with nothing. I hung up the phone and stared at the papers in front of me for a moment longer. The decision had been made. There was no going back now. The silence between us had become a battleground. and I was finally ready to fight for what was mine. The next morning, I would start the process of dividing everything we had built. I had the evidence. I had the law on my side. Tom wouldn't know what hit him. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a sterile office, the scent of polished wood and faint coffee lingering in the air. It was a place I never imagined I'd step foot in, especially not for something like this. The heavy curtains shut out the sunlight, casting the room in an almost oppressive shade. I stared at the polished mahogany desk in front of me as the lawyer, the one I'd met a few months ago, flipped through the stack of papers I had brought along. "Let's see what we have here," he said, tapping the stack with his finger as if to measure the weight of my life's worth. I could feel my pulse quicken. I had never been the type to get emotional about legal matters, but this felt like a betrayal, a loss, and a new beginning all at once. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard, glanced up at me as he flipped through the evidence. His expression was unreadable, but I knew from the way he worked that he was not surprised by what he was seeing. "You've done your homework," he said. "You've covered all your bases." "I had to," I replied, my voice low but steady. "I've been watching him for a while. I knew something was off, but it wasn't just about the money. It's about everything." He nodded, his face softened for a moment in understanding. "I can see that, and it's clear you've been patient. But patience doesn't mean you have to keep suffering." I wasn't angry anymore. I was beyond anger. It had been replaced by something colder, something more calculated. This was not about revenge. This was about getting back what was rightfully mine. It was about restoring balance. He went on, explaining the process, dividing assets, freezing accounts, and making sure that Tom couldn't liquidate anything before the settlement was final. The lawyer outlined the steps, spoke in terms I barely understood at the time, but I was listening. My mind was focused on one thing: securing my future and ensuring that Tom understood the consequences of his actions. "You have a strong case," he said after a few moments. "We'll initiate the division of property, and we'll make sure that the house is dealt with fairly. We'll start with the joint business assets. Everything will be split according to your contributions." I nodded, though something inside me clenched at the idea of all those years, 28 of them, being reduced to dollar amounts, to pieces of property. But it was necessary. I couldn't let myself be fooled into thinking that my contributions over the years had no value. They had to be counted, and they had to be acknowledged. The lawyer scribbled a few notes on his pad before setting it aside. "I'll handle the rest from here," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "We'll get the ball rolling. You'll get a fair deal." "Thank you," I said, the words coming out quieter than I intended. I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for: his professionalism or the validation that this was, in fact, the right thing to do. I stood up and gathered my papers, feeling the weight of them now. The life I had built with Tom, everything I had believed in, was crumbling right in front of me. I could feel the cold breeze of change sweeping in, but it wasn't frightening. It was freeing. As I left the lawyer's office, I walked down the steps slowly, breathing in the fresh air. It felt like a new beginning. There was no longer any mystery about what was happening to me. I wasn't being punished for something I hadn't done. I was taking control of what was mine. Tom had no idea what was coming. The illusion of control he had maintained for all these years was about to shatter. I was ready to see it happen. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the file I had gathered for so long. I had come so far, and yet I knew there was more to do. The envelope I had left on his desk wasn't just a symbol of what I was owed. It was my claim to my own dignity. It was a reminder that I had a voice, and I would use it. The silence in the house felt different now. It was oppressive, suffocating even, but it was also a silence that felt like it was filled with anticipation, the calm before the storm. The next step would come soon. But for now, I had to wait. I had to watch. And when the time came, when he saw those papers, I knew exactly how he would react. Tom was good at pretending to be in control, but beneath it all, he was just a man running from his own guilt. And soon enough, he'd have nowhere left to hide. The reckoning had begun. The following Friday, I did something I had planned carefully, down to every detail. I didn't tell him what I was doing. I didn't ask for permission. I simply acted. Tom had left early that morning for his usual round of meetings, and I knew he wouldn't be home until after 5. He was still playing the role of the hard-working businessman, and I was still his dutiful wife. But I wasn't that woman anymore. The one who tolerated, the one who waited. I waited until I knew he'd be gone for a while, and then I went to the office, pulled out the envelope I had prepared, and slipped it onto his desk. The thick legal papers inside were carefully organized. The evidence of his infidelities, the transfers, the documents that proved what he had tried to hide from me for so long. It was all there, his deception, his betrayal, his manipulation. And now it was laid out for him to face. I didn't think about how he would react. I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was that he knew I was no longer his doormat. I wasn't waiting for him to take the first step toward honesty. I was the one who was going to take charge of my own future. I left the room, closed the door behind me, and stood in the hallway for a moment. My heart was pounding, but I didn't let myself feel anything more than that steady, cold focus. I had already made my decision. There was no turning back now. Later, when I heard his car pull into the driveway, I didn't go to greet him. I stayed in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, though I couldn't taste it. My mind was focused on the scene that was about to unfold in the study. I could almost hear him, pacing in frustration as he opened the envelope, realizing the game had changed. Tom walked into the house, calling my name in his usual casual way. "Sharon?" he asked, his voice light as if everything was normal. I didn't answer right away. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the floor, as the sound of his footsteps grew louder, coming closer to the room where the envelope sat on his desk. I could hear the faint rustling of papers, the slight shift of furniture as he knocked something over in his haste. Then the shouting came. It was loud, too loud for the walls of our home, echoing in the emptiness. I didn't move. I didn't react. I knew what it was. I knew exactly how he'd respond when he saw those papers. His world was collapsing, and he had no idea how to handle it. I heard him storming into the kitchen. His face was red with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. His eyes were wild. "What the hell is this, Sharon?" he yelled, his voice cracking. I looked up at him slowly, deliberately. The man who had been the center of my world for so many years was now nothing more than a stranger, a man who had taken everything from me, and who now stood in front of me, screaming in a futile attempt to regain control. "It's what you deserve, Tom," I said softly, not flinching at his rage. "This is the reckoning you've been avoiding." His eyes flared with disbelief. "What are you talking about? You think you can just take everything from me? After everything I've done for you? All these years?" I cut him off, my voice calm and clear. "I've been the one doing everything, Tom. You've taken everything for granted, and now you're going to pay for it. This isn't just about money. This is about everything you've stolen from me." He stood there for a moment, the words sinking in. I could see the confusion on his face, the dawning realization that he had underestimated me for far too long. And then came the fury. He kicked the chair across the room, his anger now spilling over. "I built this life, Sharon. I made it all happen. You think you're just gonna walk away with everything? I stood my ground, my voice unshaken. You didn't make it happen alone. You've used me, taken advantage of my work and my trust, and now you'll have to face the consequences. I let the words hang in the air. They were heavy, and I knew they were starting to sink in. He took a deep breath, clearly trying to regain his composure, but there was something different in his eyes now. Fear. It was a look I had never seen from him before, and I hated how much I had missed it. You can't do this, he said, his voice low, more desperate now. I'll fight you. I'll fight you until the very end. I didn't react to his threats. I had heard them all before, all those years of empty promises that nothing would change, that I should just keep quiet and go along with everything. He had never thought I'd fight back, but now I wasn't going to let him control this narrative anymore. You can try, Tom, I said, turning away from him, but I've made up my mind. I'm done letting you decide my fate. I left the room without another word. I didn't need to stay for his tantrum. I knew what he would do next. Call his lawyer, probably. Try to find some loophole, some way to manipulate the situation back into his favor. But it didn't matter anymore. The die had been cast. He would have to face what he had done. And I was done playing the part of the supportive wife, the silent partner, the invisible woman behind the scenes. It was time for him to see me, really see me for the first time. Outside, I could hear the neighbors' voices in the distance, laughter and chatter rising from their backyard as they started their own Memorial Day celebration. It seemed almost unreal how normal everything still seemed out there while the world in my home was falling apart. I leaned against the doorframe, staring out into the yard, listening to the faint sound of Tom's angry voice in the background. My world was changing, but at least I was finally in control. For the first time in years, I felt free. A month passed, and with each day, the weight of what I had done seemed to lift just a little bit more. I had acted with precision, with coldness, and the results were starting to settle into place. The house was on the market. The documents had been filed. My lawyer had done his part, and now it was a matter of waiting for the process to unfold. I had always imagined this moment, the moment when the world would shift beneath me, when I would take back what had been so carelessly taken. I had pictured it 1,000 times, played it over and over in my mind like a scene from a movie, where the protagonist finally claims their rightful place in the story. But in reality, it wasn't like that. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sweeping gestures of victory. There was just silence and the quiet hum of everyday life as everything fell into place. I remember the day we put the house up for sale. Tom was a shell of the man I had known for all these years. He had turned to anger at first, shouting, swearing, promising that I would regret what I was doing. But his words had no power anymore. He was no longer a figure of authority in my life. He was just a man scrambling to salvage what was left of his world, and in doing so, he revealed his desperation. He moved into a small apartment near the highway, a stark contrast to the house we had shared for so long, with its expansive backyard and quiet suburban street. I couldn't help but think about how little he seemed to have learned from this entire ordeal. He still clung to the illusion of control, but I knew, deep down, that it was all slipping through his fingers. And Katya? She disappeared almost as quickly as she had come into his life. One moment she was his colleague, the woman he had been so eager to introduce to everyone at the barbecue, and the next, she was gone. I never asked him about it. I didn't care. But I knew, in the way you just know things when the pieces of a story finally fall into place, that she had never been anything more than a distraction. Tom's life was falling apart, and there was no one left to keep him together. His business, the one we had built together, was now in jeopardy. I wasn't there to handle the accounting anymore. The foundation of it all had been shaky from the start, and without me holding it up, the cracks were beginning to show. His future was uncertain, but that didn't concern me. I had made my peace with that. I was too busy building my own life now. The house I bought was small, but bright and full of potential. It was exactly what I needed, a fresh start. It had a garden, just like the one we used to have, but it was mine now. Every corner of it felt like a reclamation, a declaration that I was no longer trapped in the role of wife, of partner. I was Sharon, just Sharon, and that was enough. I planted flowers, vegetables, and herbs, watched them grow in the way I had always wanted to grow. I tended to my little garden like it was a part of me, nurturing it, watching it bloom under my care. The neighbors were friendly, a sharp contrast to the cold, judgmental eyes of the ones who had always lived next door in the old house. The first time I met them, I knew I had made the right decision. They were warm, open, and didn't ask questions about the past. They were just happy to welcome me into their circle, to invite me to barbecues, to share their lives with me. It was a strange feeling, but in the best way possible. It felt like I had finally found a place where I could truly breathe. A few weeks after I moved in, the Memorial Day weekend arrived. It had been a year since that disastrous barbecue, since I had stood by the grill, flipping burgers while Tom took the credit for the entire event. It was surreal thinking back on it. The memory of it all, the way I had been pushed aside, was still fresh in my mind, but now it felt like a distant memory. I had come so far from that moment. I decided to spend the day alone, in the garden, just as I had done the year before. There was no big celebration, no grand gesture, just me, the grill, and the small but satisfying feeling of independence. The heat of the grill warmed my skin as I cooked, turning the corn over with a steady hand, savoring the simplicity of the moment. The air was thick with the scent of charcoal and fresh vegetables, and I could hear the distant sounds of laughter and conversation from my neighbors' yards. It was a quiet, peaceful day, a far cry from the chaos of last year. As I flipped the corn, I thought about the years that had passed, about everything I had endured, and everything I had fought for. I had raised children, worked tirelessly alongside Tom to build a life together, only to have it all thrown away when he decided I wasn't enough for him anymore. But I had never been weak, never been the helpless woman he had always assumed I was. And now, with every turn of the grill, with every small success I had, I was reminded of that truth. My neighbors stopped by later that afternoon, as they had the year before. They brought their own food to share, offering me the kind of warmth and camaraderie I had never known in the years spent with Tom. We exchanged pleasantries, talked about the weather, the garden, and the coming summer. There was no mention of the past, no awkward questions about my ex-husband, no pity in their eyes. It was refreshing, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged. As the evening wore on, one of the neighbors asked me where Tom was. "No meat this year," I said, my voice steady. "Just vegetables, and no fat." They laughed, thinking it was a joke, and I allowed myself a small smile. But deep down, I knew the real meaning behind my words. The meat of my life had been taken from me. The weight of years spent in a loveless marriage had left its mark. But now, there was no more fat, no more excess, no more indulgence. I had stripped everything down to what mattered most. Myself. I looked out over the garden, the little patches of green I had nurtured with my own hands, and I felt a sense of peace I had never known before. When they asked me where my husband was again, I replied, "He's gone," and I'm not looking back. This time, there was no laughter, just silence, and the quiet understanding that I had finally found the strength to move on. The days following Memorial Day passed quietly, and I was content. More than content, I was peaceful, finally at peace with myself. The house I had built in my own image, one that was free from Tom's shadow, had started to feel like home in a way I hadn't experienced in years. It was small, but it was mine. Every morning I walked through the garden, touching the leaves, feeling the sun on my skin, and listening to the quiet hum of life around me. There were no more barbecues where I stood silently by the grill. No more evenings where I was overlooked and ignored. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. I recognized the envelope immediately. It was from my lawyer. I had thought the paperwork was finished, that everything had been settled, but this letter had a weight to it that immediately caught my attention. I opened it slowly, the air in the room growing still as I read through the contents. It was the final settlement agreement for the sale of the house and the division of assets. Tom had tried to contest the terms, of course, but everything had already been arranged in my favor. The house had sold for a reasonable price, more than I had expected, and with it, the final blow had been delivered. Tom had tried to manipulate the process, trying to stake his claim on everything we had worked for, but he had failed. The letter was a reminder that this was it, the end of everything, and with it, I had gained everything I needed to move on. A strange sense of satisfaction washed over me. This wasn't just a financial victory. It was something more profound. It was the reclaiming of my life. I had stood in the shadows for too long, had let him decide everything for me. Now, I was the one in control. It was my time to take back what had been stolen from me, piece by piece, over the course of nearly 3 decades. That evening, I took a walk around my garden, the sun sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows over the vibrant flowers I had planted. The air smelled like summer, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. I thought back to everything I had endured with Tom, the years of working together, building something that was supposed to be ours. I thought about the quiet resentment that had grown over the years, the way he had taken me for granted, expecting me to always be there, always to support him, without ever considering my own needs or desires. He had assumed I would never leave, but I had. In that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. This life, this house, was my new beginning. There were no more compromises, no more silences. I had earned this peace. As the night crept in, I sat on the small porch outside my house, sipping a glass of wine. The stars twinkled overhead, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I didn't think about Tom anymore. He was no longer part of my story. The chapter with him had closed, and I was ready for whatever came next. The phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I checked the screen and saw it was from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the best of me, and I answered. Sharon? A voice I recognized immediately. It was Tom. I felt a rush of indifference. It had been weeks since I had heard from him, and the last thing I wanted to do was revisit that past. But I knew I had to listen. What do you want? I asked, my voice steady. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet finality. I I don't know what happened, Sharon, he said, his voice sounding tired. I don't know how things got so messed up. I don't even know where to begin. I let him speak. I let him ramble on about the mistakes he had made, the regrets he felt. But it was all empty. He had always been good at apologizing, but I had learned that his apologies were just words, words with no substance. I wasn't interested in hearing any more of them. I'm done, Tom, I said, cutting him off. I don't need your apologies. I don't need anything from you anymore. There was a long pause, and then he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. You really think you can just walk away from everything? He asked. From all of it? After all these years, I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was the moment I had prepared for, the moment where he would try to pull me back in, but I wasn't falling for it. I already walked away, Tom, I said, the words final, and it was the best decision I've ever made. Goodbye. I ended the call before he could say anything else. It wasn't that I didn't care. I had spent so much of my life caring, trying to hold everything together, trying to make it work. But that wasn't my job anymore. I stood up from the porch and walked back into the house, feeling the cool air of the evening wrap around me. The quiet hum of the world outside seemed like a distant echo as I closed the door behind me. I had walked away from the past, and now I was free. The next Memorial Day would be mine. I would be the one grilling the corn, the one making the decisions, the one who had taken control of her own life. And when the neighbors asked about my ex-husband, I would smile and say, "He's gone, and I'm better off for it." There would be no more meat, no more fat, just the simple satisfaction of knowing that, for the first time in a long time, I was the one who had come out on top. The end of one chapter, the beginning of another. And this time, the story was mine to write.